They say there are certain people the whole city holds its breath for whenever they pass. Desmond Kelleher was one of them. No one in Chicago dared speak his name aloud. They spoke it with lowered eyes, with doors quietly closing, with a fear so deep it had become a habit. He owned casinos that never slept, money that never left a trace, and a heart that people whispered had stopped knowing how to feel a very long time ago. But that night, in the most lavish banquet hall in the city, among glittering crystal and the laughter of powerful men, a woman walked in carrying a tray slowly, wearily, heavy with child, her hands roughened by years of waiting tables and quiet endurance. She did not know who the man at the head of the table was. She did not know that 9 years ago, she had once saved his life when he was nothing but a starving, trembling boy with no home, running from something she had never dared to ask about. Then he looked up, and as he reached out, the cuff of his sleeve shifted, revealing a worn leather bracelet on his wrist faded silver with age, the very bracelet she had once tied around his wrist 9 years ago, like a promise that he would survive. As his eyes locked onto her face, the heavy crystal glass slipped from his numb fingers and smashed onto the marble floor. But he didn't even glance down at the shards, because in that moment, the man the whole city feared became, once more, the boy he used to be, the boy whose life had been saved by a poor young woman, with half a meal and a kindness that asked for nothing in return. The elegant woman seated beside him, the one who believed it was her right to decide who deserved a place in this world, had just looked upon that waitress with contempt in her eyes. She had no idea that the very woman she had just humiliated would come to shake everything. And what Desmond was about to discover about the girl from all those years ago, about everything that had happened to her during the years he was gone, would shake the very empire he had traded his soul to build. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Now, let us turn back the clock to where it all began, and see how that fateful night in Chicago truly unfolded. The banquet hall that night was so brilliantly lit that it seemed as though the entire city of Chicago had poured every last glimmer of its light into that single place. Crystal chandeliers descended from the soaring ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over tailored suits and evening gowns worth an ordinary worker's entire annual salary. The sound of piano music drifted between murmured business conversations, carefully measured laughter, and handshakes that concealed a calculation behind every clasp. This was the world of people who bought and sold power as casually as others bought and sold wine. And Rhea Callahan knew perfectly well that she didn't belong there. She was merely one of the uniformed shadows moving quietly between the tables, carrying trays of champagne and plates of exquisite food that many guests barely touched to their lips before leaving behind. She had grown accustomed to being invisible. Sometimes, invisibility was a kind of safety. She walked slowly, one hand balancing the silver tray, while the other rested instinctively against the gentle curve of her rounded belly, as though she were trying to reassure the tiny life growing inside her that everything was still all right, that in only a few more hours her shift would end and the two of them would be able to go home. But that night, her invisibility was shattered. A voice rang out, sharp and sweet as a blade dipped in honey, cutting through the air just as she passed the central table. The woman's name was Cora Vance, and the entire room seemed to turn slightly toward her whenever she spoke. She wore a gown, the deep color of red wine. Glittering stones encircled her throat, and upon her face rested the smile of someone accustomed to seeing the whole world bow before her. She looked Rhea over from head to toe, slowly, like someone examining a stain on an expensive carpet. She spoke loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, saying that she couldn't understand when an event intended for people of standing had begun allowing someone like Rhea to enter, and that perhaps the management ought to reconsider its hiring standards. Then she lowered her voice slightly and adopted a counterfeit note of sympathy, saying how tragic it was that a woman in Rhea's condition, pregnant and without anyone to rely upon, should have to drag herself through a place where every step reminded her of just how far beneath everyone else she truly was. A few soft giggles rose around the table. They didn't laugh because Cora's words were genuinely amusing, but because they understood that laughing with Cora Vance was the safest way to be counted among her allies. One man raised his glass to hide his mouth. Another woman turned toward her companion and whispered something, and the two of them broke into laughter together. The eyes of an entire section of the banquet hall were now fixed upon the server standing silently with the tray in her hands. Rhea didn't lower her head, nor did she lift it in defiance. She simply stood there with her back straight, her calm gray eyes meeting Cora's directly, and in that moment there was something about her that made the smile on the woman's lips falter for half a heartbeat. It wasn't the submission Cora had expected. It was the composure of someone who had already walked through so many dark nights that an insult spoken in the middle of a banquet hall no longer possessed the strength to bring her to her knees. The tray trembled almost imperceptibly in her hands, just enough for the glasses to touch and release a faint, delicate chime. But her face didn't change. She inclined her head slightly and spoke in a low, measured voice, saying that she was sorry if her presence had disturbed the guest, that she was there only to do her job, and that she would leave immediately. There was no protest. There were no tears. She didn't explain that this job was the only thing keeping her and her unborn child from ending up on the street. She didn't say that she had been standing since the afternoon, that her legs had long since gone numb, or that she had accepted the night shift because it paid a little more. Those truths didn't belong in this room, and she had no intention of granting Cora the satisfaction of seeing her pain. Yet it was precisely that dignified silence that angered Cora even more. She wasn't accustomed to seeing someone beneath her stand so straight. She stepped forward, preparing to say something even crueler, and raised her hand as though she meant to knock the tray aside and force the young woman to kneel before everyone and gather up each shattered piece. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the next humiliation, as crowds so often did when the powerful were about to crush the weak. Rhea still didn't move. She only tightened her grip on the tray, drew in a deep breath. And in that moment her mind wasn't filled with shame, but with the face of the little boy waiting for her at home and the faint movement beneath the palm resting against her belly. She reminded herself that she had endured things far worse than this. She would endure this too. She prepared to turn away and leave, to bring an end to the entertainment these people had chosen to create at her expense. But at that very moment, at the far end of the banquet table, a man who had been sitting motionless between two guests suddenly lifted his head. And for reasons no one could yet explain, the entire room began to sense a change in the air, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees before anyone had time to understand why. The dry scrape of a chair against the marble floor cut through the room as Desmond Kelleher suddenly rose to his feet, his gaze locked onto the weary face of the waitress. The heavy crystal glass slipped from his fingers, smashing violently against the marble floor. Yet, amid the sharp echo of breaking glass, Desmond's gaze never drifted. It remained pinned to the woman he thought he had lost forever. The people seated nearest to him instinctively leaned away, as though a current of cold air had just passed through. Because throughout that evening, just as throughout every evening when they had been granted the privilege of sitting at the same table with him, not one of them had ever seen that man leave his seat for anything. People came to him. He didn't go to anyone. Yet now he was walking, slowly, through the crowd as it parted on both sides like water before the bow of a ship, and every eye in the room followed each of his steps while no one understood what was happening. The pianist stopped in the middle of a piece. Another server froze with a wine bottle still tilted in his hand. That lavish room, which only moments before had been filled with contemptuous laughter, now sank into a silence so dense that people could hear the beating of their own hearts. Desmond stopped in front of Rhea, close enough that she had to lift her face to see all of his, a face carved from cold, severe lines, with dark blue eyes like the surface of a frozen lake and a faint scar running along his jaw. She stepped back half a pace on instinct, gripping the tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white, because she understood perfectly well whom she was standing before, or at least she understood that this man was the kind of person before whom an entire room full of powerful people lowered their heads. She didn't know his name. She only knew that a vague fear was rising inside her chest, the fear of a small animal realizing that it had wandered into the territory of a predator. He stood before her in deathly silence, his cold gaze locked onto her exhausted face. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his fingers, he reached down and slowly pulled back the left sleeve of his tailored suit, revealing a worn leather bracelet bound tightly around his wrist, faded silver with age, completely out of place amid the sea of diamonds, gold, and silver in that room. Rhea's gray eyes fell upon it, and the breath caught in her throat. Her mind spun in disbelief as she recognized the very bracelet she had tied around a trembling boy's wrist on a snowbound night 9 years ago. Then he spoke, and his voice was no longer the commanding tone the entire city feared, not the kind of sound that made others tremble, but something low, rough, and breaking at the end of the sentence as though he hadn't used it in this way for many long years. He asked her, in a whisper that barely carried above the silence of the hall, if she truly remembered the worn leather promise bound around his wrist. Rhea blinked, stunned and confused, her vision blurring as 9 winters of memories, Unspoken prayers and silent grief came crashing back into her mind all at once. She was too stunned to speak. Something was happening behind those cold eyes, a silent storm that no one in the room could read. And his hand, the same hand that had once signed orders that made people disappear without a trace, was now trembling faintly at his side. It was then that Cora Vance, unable to bear being pushed out of the center of attention, stepped between them. She laughed, a strained sound meant to appear intimate, and told Desmond that he didn't need to concern himself with such a trivial matter, that she would have the manager called to remove the server immediately so he wouldn't have to endure any further inconvenience. She placed her perfectly manicured hand on his arm, a familiar, possessive gesture she often made in front of others, as though declaring to the entire room that this man belonged to her. But this time, Desmond turned his head and looked at her, slowly, and that look was so cold that her hand withdrew on its own. He told her, one word at a time, clear and sharp as steel, that she should take her hand off him and remain silent, that she had no idea what mistake she had nearly made, and that if she said one more word about this woman, she would regret it for a very long time. Cora's face visibly drained of color beneath her flawless makeup. Never, throughout all the time she had stood beside him, had he spoken to her in that voice, the voice he reserved for enemies, rather than for the woman she believed was about to become his wife. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out, because the eyes of every powerful person in the room were now fixed upon her, witnessing the moment she was diminished at the very center of the stage she had believed she controlled. In that deathly silence, something had just fractured. Not only the glass that had fallen to the floor, but an entire order that Cora had spent so long carefully building. And Rhea, standing between two invisible forces colliding with one another, could only feel her heart pounding, because she realized that this terrifying man, for a reason she couldn't yet understand, had just stepped forward to shield her from an entire room. To understand why that entire room had held its breath when Desmond Kelleher rose from his chair, one first had to know what happened beneath the polished surface of the world he ruled, what took place in the places where chandelier light could never reach. Only a few nights before that banquet, inside an abandoned warehouse near the river on the southern edge of the city, a man named Bracken had learned the price of betrayal in a way he would never forget. Bracken had once belonged to the organization, a man trusted enough to handle the numbers, trusted enough to know where the money came from and where it went, and precisely because he knew too much, when he decided to sell what he knew to a rival gang in exchange for money and a way out, he had signed his own death sentence with his own hand. That night, he was brought to the warehouse with his hands tied behind his back, sweat streaming down his face even though the air was so cold that the breath of everyone present gathered in pale clouds before them. Desmond entered without haste. He didn't shout, didn't break anything, and didn't do any of the things people imagined powerful men did when they were angry. He simply walked in, removed his overcoat, folded it carefully, and placed it on a wooden crate, like a man preparing to begin a familiar and tedious task. That calmness was more terrifying than any fit of rage could have been. Bracken began to beg, his voice breaking as he swore that it was all a misunderstanding, that he had never told anyone anything, that he had remained loyal for so many years. Desmond allowed him to finish. He didn't interrupt. He listened patiently, as though he truly cared about every excuse. And it was that silent attention that frightened everyone most, because every man in the room understood that when Desmond Kelleher allowed someone to speak for so long, it was because he had already decided that person's fate before he ever stepped through the door. When Bracken finally ran out of words, Desmond sat down in a chair opposite him, rested his elbows on his knees, and asked him a single question in a voice so low and steady that it chilled the blood, whether he knew what Desmond despised most in this world. Bracken didn't dare answer. Desmond continued on his own, saying that it wasn't an enemy, because an enemy was at least honest about wanting to destroy him, but rather the man who had sat at his table, eaten food he had paid for, looked him in the eyes and smiled while the hand hidden behind his back was selling him to someone else. He said that loyalty was the only thing he still believed in within this rotten world, and that a man who trampled upon it no longer had a place in his world. Then he stood, picked up his coat, placed it over his shoulders with unhurried care, and gave the men around him a faint nod that was almost too slight to notice. He didn't remain to watch what happened next. He didn't need to. He walked out of the warehouse, leaving Bracken's final pleas behind him to be swallowed by the darkness. And when he stepped into the night air, there wasn't the slightest trace of emotion on his face, as though he had just left a dull meeting rather than decided whether another man would live or die. People whispered that Desmond Kelleher's heart had forgotten how to feel long ago, and those who had witnessed nights like that believed the rumor was true, believed that whatever boy had once existed inside that man had died many years earlier, buried beneath layer after layer of cold commands and doors that closed in silence. That was the man who had risen in the middle of the banquet, pulling back his sleeve to show a humble waitress the old leather bracelet on his wrist. That was the man the entire room feared, the man who could make someone disappear with nothing more than a nod. And yet that night, when he revealed that worn promise to Rhea, something within the thick ice that had surrounded him for so long suddenly cracked, and for the first time in 9 years, the hand that had spread fear throughout the city trembled for a reason he himself still didn't dare name. That leather bracelet had passed through 9 winters before finding itself once again beneath the chandelier light of a banquet hall, and its story had begun on a bitterly cold night inside a small laundromat on the corner of a poor street on the south side of Chicago, back when Rhea was still a thin college student working the night shift to pay her tuition and the rent on a cramped attic room. The laundromat stayed open all night, its machines turning steadily, filling the air with warmth and the scent of soap. And during the deepest hours of the night, Rhea was often the only person there, sitting behind the counter with a textbook open across her lap and a container of cold food she had brought from home. That night, the snow fell so heavily that the entire street seemed covered beneath a silent white blanket, and in the midst of that skin-cutting cold, the glass door burst open, bringing with it a blast of freezing wind and a staggering figure who collapsed inside. He was a teenage boy, perhaps only 18 or 19 years old, thin enough for his bones to show, his lips blue with cold, his flimsy coat torn open at one shoulder and soaked with what she immediately recognized as blood. He crumpled onto the tile floor, both hands clutching his ribs, his frightened eyes lifting toward her with the look of an animal driven into a corner, ready to flee if she showed even the slightest sign of danger. Rhea could have called the police. She could have ordered him back outside, locked the door, and pretended she had never seen him, because that was the sensible thing anyone in her position should have done. But she didn't. All she saw was a child who was hungry and bleeding, and something inside her, something that had grown from the long years of her own lonely life, when no one had been waiting for her, wouldn't allow her to turn away. She locked the door, drew the curtain across the glass, and knelt beside him. She took out her food, the only thing she had, pushed it toward him, and told him to eat, slowly, so he wouldn't choke. The boy looked at the container and then at her, his eyes filled with suspicion, as though he couldn't believe there was still anyone in the world who would give without demanding something in return. Then hunger overcame distrust, and he began to devour the food, his hands trembling so badly that grains of rice scattered across the floor. She allowed him to finish half before gently stopping his hand and telling him that he needed to save the rest, because she didn't know when he would have another meal. After that, she retrieved the small first aid kit the laundromat kept beneath the counter, and with careful, skillful hands, she cleaned the wound on his shoulder and bandaged it gently, never asking why he had been hurt, why he was running, or whom he was running from. She understood that there were questions for which choosing not to ask was itself an act of kindness. That night, she let him sleep on the long bench beside the row of dryers, the warmest place in the laundromat, and covered him with her own coat. He slept like someone who had reached the very end of his strength, and in sleep, for the first time, the terror left his face, revealing the boyish innocence that fear had hidden for so long. Near dawn, while the sky was still dark and the snow continued to fall, he woke and knew he had to leave before daylight, before the people pursuing him discovered that place. He stood in the doorway, hesitating, unable to find the words for the young woman who had just saved his life. It was then that Rhea removed the leather bracelet from her own wrist, an old and nearly worthless thing, the only possession she could give, and fastened it around his thin wrist. She looked directly into his eyes and told him, in a voice as firm as a vow, that no matter what he was running from, he had to survive, that he had to promise her he would live, that he would go far away from that place and keep living. The boy closed his hand tightly around the bracelet, nodded, and something appeared in his eyes that she would remember for the rest of her life, a gratitude far too immense for a boy so young. Then he stepped out into the curtain of white snow and disappeared, leaving behind no name, no promise to return, only a question in her heart that would follow her for many years, whether that boy had truly survived, and what kind of man he had become somewhere out there in the world. Back in the banquet hall, amid the heavy silence still hanging in the air after the warning Desmond had thrown at Cora, Rhea stood with the tray in her hands, struggling to understand what was happening to her. The frightening man was still looking at her, and there was something in his eyes that felt both familiar and impossibly distant, leaving her deeply unsettled. He asked a server to bring him a cup of hot tea, and when the cup was placed on a nearby table, he reached out and picked it up, and that single moment made Ria's heart seem to stop. He didn't hold the cup the way a powerful man accustomed to being served would hold it. Instead, he lifted it with both hands, cupping it carefully, and drawing it close to his palms as though he wanted to preserve every last trace of warmth, as though somewhere deep inside him there still lived a memory of bitter nights when warmth had been the rarest luxury in the world. It was such a small gesture, one that no one else in the room noticed, but to Ria it was the final, heartbreaking proof tearing away any last sliver of doubt. She had seen those hands do that before, back when they had been thin and trembling around a container of cold food inside a snowbound laundromat. She had bandaged those hands. She had once placed a promise around that wrist. Her breath caught in her chest, and she stared at him, her gray eyes widening as she searched his cold, scarred face for some trace of the boy he had once been. And when she found it, buried deep within those dark blue eyes, she nearly dropped the tray. It couldn't be possible. Could the starving, trembling boy she had rescued, the boy she had prayed for through all those years, hoping he had survived somewhere out in the world, truly be this man, the man before whom an entire city bowed, the man who had spoken to Cora only moments earlier in a voice that sent cold fear down everyone's spine? She didn't dare believe it. She didn't want to believe it. And at the same time as recognition swept over her, an entirely different panic rose and drowned her, because if this man truly was the boy from that long ago winter, then it meant he was seeing her, seeing what she had become after 9 years, an exhausted server in an old uniform, carrying a child, without a stable home, moments after being turned into an object of ridicule before a crowd. She had imagined this reunion so many times during long and lonely nights, but never, in any version of it, had she imagined herself looking this worn and broken. She couldn't bear the thought that the boy she had once protected would now look at her with pity, that the one person who had once seen her as a savior would now see her as someone helpless, someone in need of charity. The last fragment of pride she still possessed, the same pride that had helped her remain standing beneath Cora's humiliation, was now the very thing making her want to run. He spoke softly and called to her, his voice trembling as he asked whether it was truly her, whether she was the woman from that snowy night, and the way he said it told her that he had recognized her too. But Ria shook her head and stepped back, her vision now blurring with the tears she was desperately trying to hold in, and she stammered that he had mistaken her for someone else, that she was only a server, and that she had to leave immediately. She hurriedly set the tray down on a nearby table and turned toward the staff exit, walking as quickly as she could, her legs unsteady, one hand supporting her belly while her heart pounded so violently that she could hear it throbbing in her temples. Behind her, she heard him call after her, this time clearly and with desperate urgency, a sound that surely no one in that room had ever heard from the mouth of that man. But she didn't dare turn around. She rushed through the rear door, crossed the noisy kitchen, pushed open the exit, and stepped into the alley behind the restaurant, where the bitter night air struck her face. She kept moving quickly, almost running, out of the alley and into the flow of people along the nighttime street. By the time Desmond finally pushed past the stunned crowd and reached the street, all he could see were streaking headlights and the silhouettes of strangers. The woman who had brought his entire past back to him had vanished into the night, just as he had vanished from her 9 years before. Desmond Kelleher wasn't a man who easily let go when there was something he wanted to find, and throughout the days that followed that night, he used every resource at his disposal to trace the woman who had vanished into the darkness. For a man who could make an entire city fall silent, discovering the true name and whereabouts of a waitress wasn't difficult. But what surprised him, and made something inside his chest tighten, was what he uncovered about the life she had lived during the 9 years he had been gone. He learned that she worked at a small, aging diner in a poor working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city, a place with a faded sign and windows clouded by steam, where she accepted both day shifts and night shifts whenever they allowed her, even as her belly grew heavier with each passing day. He had his people investigate, and piece by piece, the fragments of a difficult life began to appear before him like a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. She lived in a cramped, rented room on the 3rd floor of an old building, a room so small that there was barely enough space for a bed, a crooked table, and a tiny kitchen corner, where on nights when the wind slipped through the gaps around the window, Rags had to be stuffed into the cracks to keep the warmth inside. One evening, instead of sending someone in his place, Desmond drove to that neighborhood himself, parked his expensive car in a shadowed corner, and stood silently in the darkness across the street, looking up at the illuminated third-floor window. Through that window, he saw a scene that left him rooted to the spot, unable to move. Inside the small room, Rhea was sitting beside a boy of perhaps 7 or 8 years old, a child with tousled brown hair and bright, shining eyes, and she was feeding him spoonful by spoonful of hot porridge. The boy giggled at something she had just told him, and she laughed with him, a smile Desmond had never seen on her in the banquet hall, a smile that lit up her tired face and, for a moment, made her look as young as the girl she had once been in the laundromat. She told the boy a story, moving her hands to act out the details, and the child, whose name was Noah, clutched his stomach with laughter before begging her to tell it again. She pretended to sigh and then repeated it, patiently and gently, and when the boy let out a long yawn, she pulled the thin blanket over him and stroked his hair until he drifted to sleep. Desmond stood below in the cold of the nighttime street, and he felt something strange tightening around his chest. This woman had nothing, had to struggle for every dollar merely to survive each day, was carrying a child and would soon have another mouth to feed, and yet she was still taking care of a boy who wasn't related to her by blood, still finding within her poverty enough love to give to another living soul. Well, he thought of himself, of the vast empire he owned, of the sums of money so immense that even he couldn't count them all, and he realized that the impoverished woman inside that tiny room was richer than he was in a way none of his wealth could ever buy. He discovered something else as well through the information his men collected, a detail that had seemed meaningless at first but continued to linger in his mind, that recently a stranger had been seen hanging around the neighborhood asking questions about her, a man whose identity no one clearly knew, and that news stirred the instincts of caution within Desmond, the instincts of someone who had spent his entire life surrounded by danger. Even though he couldn't yet understand why anyone would be watching a poor waitress, he remained there for a long time, until the light in the third-floor window finally went out and the entire room sank into darkness. In that darkness, he knew there was a woman sleeping with her arms around her unborn child, beside a boy she had chosen to love, even though no one had ever asked her to do so. And Desmond Kelleher, the man the whole city believed had lost his heart long ago, stood silently beneath the night sky as a determination steadily grew inside him, that whether she wanted it or not, no matter how many times she ran from him, this time he wouldn't allow her to disappear from his life again. He came to the diner late one afternoon, just as her shift was nearing its end, chose a table in the corner, and sat there in silence to wait. When Rhea stepped out of the kitchen with her apron still carrying the scent of coffee and cooking grease, she stopped the instant she saw him, because the presence of a man like him in a humble place like that was like a panther walking into the middle of a flock of sheep. She had meant to turn away, but he rose to his feet, and the look in his eyes told her that this time he wouldn't allow her to run. Reluctantly, she sat across from him, her hands folded together on the tabletop, and asked him directly what he wanted from her, her voice guarded but not afraid. Desmond studied her for a long moment before he finally spoke, telling her that he knew her life was difficult, that he could provide her with a decent place to live, enough money so she wouldn't have to work herself to exhaustion while carrying a child, enough so that she and the boy wouldn't have to worry about tomorrow. He said those things awkwardly, not in the commanding voice he usually used, but like a man trying to offer the only thing he understood how to give, which was money. But Rhea shook her head before he had even finished. In a calm but unwavering voice, she told him that she didn't need his money, that what she had done for the boy in the laundromat all those years ago hadn't been an investment she was now sitting there to collect interest on. She said she had saved a starving child because it was the right thing to do, not because she wanted anything in return, and that if she accepted his money now, it would mean everything she had once done had become something that could be bought and bargained over, and she would rather spend the rest of her life carrying plates than allow that to happen. Desmond fell silent at her answer, because he had grown far too accustomed to a world where everything had a price, where every person could be bought if the number was high enough, and now he was sitting before a woman who had nothing, and yet refused him so completely that it left him both bewildered and deeply respectful. Then she asked him, her voice growing softer, the question that had weighed on her heart for so many years, why he had left that morning without a word of farewell, why he had vanished so completely as though he had never existed, leaving her to spend night after night wondering whether the boy she had saved was still alive or had died somewhere in the freezing snow. This time, It was Desmond who lowered his head, and when he spoke, his voice deepened beneath the weight of something he had never told anyone. He explained that on that night, he had been running from the men who had murdered his foster father, men who wanted him dead as well, because he knew too much. And that when he left the laundromat that morning, he understood that as long as he remained near her, she would be in danger, that if those men ever learned a young woman had hidden him, they wouldn't spare her. He said that was why he had forced himself to go far away, to cut every tie, to disappear from her life in order to keep her safe, even though doing so had torn him apart inside. But he also confessed that he hadn't remained completely silent, as she believed, that before leaving the city for good, he had written her a long letter explaining everything and promising that one day, when it was safe, he would return to find her, and that he had entrusted it to a trusted associate, a man who would later turn out to be Arlo Fenn, to place it directly into her hands. He explained that after secretly helping her during her darkest hours, the violence of his rising empire became too dangerous, and he forced himself to stay away completely, believing that any further contact would only put her life in deadly jeopardy. As Rhea listened, she felt the entire world tilt beneath her, because she had never received any letter, not a single line, not one message, and she realized that for 9 years, the two of them had been living inside opposite halves of the same misunderstanding, each believing the other had turned away, when the truth was that something, or someone, had stood between them, and the letter had never reached the place where it was meant to go. She sat there with a trembling hand pressed to her mouth, and for the first time since seeing him again, the cold wall of dignity she had built to protect herself began to crack, revealing the pain of a woman who had just understood that the loneliest years of her life might have been different, all because of a letter that had never reached her hands. After that afternoon, Desmond began finding excuses to stop by the diner more often, not to offer her anything again, but simply to sit there, drink a cup of weak coffee, and watch in silence, and little by little, through the scattered fragments of conversation she allowed to slip between trips to the tables, through her pauses and the distant looks that sometimes crossed her face, he began piecing together the story of this woman's life, a story that broke his heart even more than the poverty he had already witnessed. He realized that Rhea had never known an easy life, that she had grown up in deep poverty alongside a sickly mother, moving from one cramped room to another, constantly struggling to survive, and learning very early that she had to be her own support. Once, when he asked about her family, she only gave a faint smile, a smile without bitterness, carrying only the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned very early not to expect too much, and she said that she had been taking care of herself since she was very young, that she had never had anyone to lean on, so she had taught herself to become her own support. That, he came to understand, was why she hadn't hesitated all those years ago to save a starving stranger, because she knew too well what it felt like to have no one in the world waiting for you, and she couldn't bear to let another living soul endure the same loneliness. He also gradually came to understand why she was carrying this pregnancy alone. One day, when a customer casually asked where the baby's father was, he saw her face tighten for the briefest moment, and later, when only the two of them remained, she quietly told him, in an even voice as though speaking about someone else's life, that she had once been engaged to an accountant, a gentle and meticulous man whom she had believed would build a home with her. But when she told him she was pregnant, instead of joy, she saw a strange fear in his eyes, and not long afterward he vanished from her life without explanation, leaving behind debts in her name that she had never even known she had signed for. She said that throughout these painful months, she had felt deeply bitter toward him, believing he was a coward who abandoned her at the very moment she needed him most, leaving her to face both the debt and the pregnancy alone. Desmond listened as an indescribable feeling stirred within him, a vague instinct that the story of the vanished accountant might not be as simple as she believed, that something hidden lay beneath it, something even she had never known. But he kept that thought to himself. What moved him most wasn't the losses she had endured, but the way she faced them, because despite everything that had broken around her, she had never allowed her heart to become hardened. He saw that most clearly in the way she cared for Noah. One evening, after he drove her home and lingered in the hallway, he watched her approach the sleeping boy's bed, gently pull the blanket higher over him, and stand there for a long while with an expression so tender it ached to witness, the gaze of someone who had once nearly lost the most precious thing in her life, and therefore cherished it beyond measure. Only later did he learn that there had been a time when the boy had become gravely ill, that to keep him alive, Rhea had sold the few possessions she owned and worked herself to exhaustion day and night, and that Noah had finally survived, growing healthy again. And from that moment on, he had become her reason for living, the reason she continued to rise every morning. She didn't speak of it as an achievement or as a hardship meant to earn anyone's sympathy. She mentioned it only in passing, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. But it was precisely that quietness that made Desmond look at her with a respect that deepened each day. He realized that the woman sitting before him had endured more loss than most of the people he had ever known in his ruthless world. And yet she had preserved something he himself had lost long ago, the ability to love without asking for anything in return, the ability to give even when she had almost nothing left. One afternoon, Rhea told Desmond something she had been carrying in her heart for a long time, that she wanted to find work better than waiting tables at the diner, not because she looked down on what she was doing now, but because she knew she was capable of more, because she had skillful hands and a passion for cooking that she had never been given the chance to pursue. As she spoke, her eyes brightened with a rare spark of hope, and for a moment Desmond nearly blurted out that he could arrange a position for her in any restaurant he owned across the city with a single phone call. But he stopped himself in time. He looked into her eyes and understood that if he did that, he would be taking away the very thing she longed for most, the feeling of accomplishing something through her own ability. He remembered the way she had refused his money, the way she had held her head high in the middle of the banquet hall, and he realized that loving someone like Rhea didn't mean clearing every obstacle from the road before her, but stepping back far enough to allow her to walk it on her own. It was a lesson entirely foreign to him, because all his life he had been accustomed to controlling everything, arranging every piece, bending the world to his will, and now he had to learn how to let go, how to stand quietly at the edge and simply watch, something more difficult for him than any battle he had ever faced. So instead of opening the way for her himself, he merely mentioned the name of a restaurant that was hiring an assistant cook, a restaurant she had no idea was connected to him, and then allowed her to go there and apply on her own. Rhea went, completed the cooking trial like every other applicant, and when the head chef tasted the dish she prepared, he nodded and hired her immediately, never knowing that this woman had any connection to the hidden owner of the entire restaurant chain. She returned home that evening glowing with the happiness of someone who had earned something for herself. And when she told Desmond that she had been hired, that it was because of what her own hands could do, he only smiled and congratulated her, keeping to himself the truth that he had quietly stood behind her, only long enough to create the door, while the choice and the courage to walk through it had belonged entirely to her. In the days that followed, something between them began to change. Desmond remained cold and frightening in his own world, still issuing commands that made others tremble, still carrying within him the layers of ice that years of darkness had built around his heart. But whenever he was with Rhea, some part of him softened, as though her presence was the only thing capable of reaching the boy who had long been buried deep inside him. He began visiting more often, not as a benefactor or a powerful man, but simply as someone who wanted to be near her. Sometimes he sat in the corner of her kitchen, awkwardly helping her pick through vegetables or dry the dishes, the hands that had once spread fear now clumsy with ordinary tasks he had never performed in his life. And Rhea would laugh at his awkwardness, a sound that warmed his chest in a way no amount of money ever had. Noah gradually grew accustomed to having him there, and one evening, while Desmond helped the boy assemble a model airplane from small pieces of wood, Noah looked up and asked whether he was Miss Rhea's friend. Desmond paused at the simplicity of the question, then gave a slight nod and said that yes, he was a very old friend of hers. The warm familiarity slowly taking root inside that little room was something neither Desmond nor Rhea dared to name, but both of them could feel it, an affection being rebuilt patiently over the remains of old wounds, fragile yet persistent, like a young plant pushing its way through cracks in concrete. And while those two wounded people were cautiously finding their way back to one another, somewhere else in the city, inside lavish rooms where light never reached the truth, a pair of eyes was watching them with a hatred that was quietly beginning to boil. Cora Vance wasn't the kind of woman who could be easily deceived, and in the weeks following the night of the banquet, she began to notice a change in the man she had always believed was about to belong to her, a change so subtle that no outsider would have seen it, yet distinct enough to set every sharp instinct within her ringing with alarm. Desmond began missing meetings he had never once failed to attend, began turning away from deals he would once have seized without hesitation, began handing over to his subordinates decisions he had always kept firmly in his own hands. To most people, these were merely signs of a weary kingpin, but to Cora, they meant something far more terrifying, because she understood that the entire fortune of her family was bound tightly to Desmond's empire. The Vance family had poured an enormous amount of wealth into ventures shared with him, had wagered the future of their entire bloodline on the marriage everyone believed would soon take place between her and Desmond. And if he withdrew, if he abandoned the empire he ruled, then everything her family had invested would vanish into nothing, and she herself would fall from being the woman destined to become mistress of an entire criminal kingdom to a penniless outcast shunned by high society. For Cora, this was no longer a matter of a wounded heart or wounded pride. It had become a matter of survival. And when her survival was threatened, she was willing to do anything. She began ordering a thorough investigation into the woman who had appeared and overturned everything, the poor waitress she had scorned in the banquet hall, and she couldn't understand how someone so ordinary could possess the power to make the most powerful man in the city turn his back on an empire. She searched through every corner of Ria's life, hired people who specialized in digging through the pasts of others, and little by little, pages of information about the woman were laid across her desk, from Ria's impoverished childhood with her sickly mother, to the debt carried in her name, to the fiancé who had disappeared. Yet it was one seemingly meaningless document that made Cora stop, and a cold smile slowly appeared on her lips. It was a medical record showing that Ria was pregnant, and when Cora calculated the dates written on it, she realized that the child had been conceived before Ria encountered Desmond again at the banquet. Cora sat in silence for a long time, turning the paper slowly between her fingers, while a poisonous plan began taking shape in her mind. She understood that Desmond still didn't know about the pregnancy, or that if he did, he didn't yet know the full story, because Ria was the kind of woman who would never use her private suffering to gain sympathy or advantage. And Cora also understood that Desmond's lack of knowledge was an opening she could widen. How easily could a man blinded by the return of a beautiful memory be shaken if she planted doubt inside him, if she twisted the truth about the pregnancy and made him believe that the woman he had placed on a pedestal was nothing more than someone using him, someone carrying another man's child while still trying to cling to him for money and status. She decided not to play that card immediately, but to keep it hidden, allowing it to grow like a dagger concealed inside her sleeve, waiting for the precise moment when it could cause the greatest destruction. She locked the medical record inside a drawer, and in the darkness of her lavish room, Cora Vance smiled to herself, certain that she now held the weapon that would allow her to reclaim everything slipping from her grasp. She had no idea that by concealing the secret instead of allowing it to be revealed honestly, she was igniting a chain of events that even she would soon be unable to control, and that some daggers, once drawn, turn backward and wound the very person who sharpened them. But Cora wasn't patient enough to wait as long as she had planned, because with each passing day she watched Desmond slip farther beyond her reach, and her growing desperation finally drove her to launch her first attack, not with the medical record she was still holding in reserve, but with a weapon far more public and cruel. She decided to strike using both the leaked medical record and a fabricated story, making her attack terrifyingly effective because it was built upon a distorted fragment of truth. Her people had secretly recorded a short video showing Desmond stepping out of a luxurious car and placing an envelope into Ria's hand outside her building, an entirely innocent moment, because the envelope contained nothing more than papers related to the new job that he wanted her to review. But once the footage was skillfully edited, with the beginning and the end removed, and only the precise moment when the kingpin placed the envelope into the woman's hand preserved, it became an image heavy with implication. The video was released across social media with a poisonous caption claiming that the most powerful kingpin in the city was being manipulated by a scheming woman, that she was a penniless opportunist who had invented an entire story about an old love in order to cling to him and drain his fortune, and that the child she was carrying was nothing more than a scheme to bind a wealthy man to her. Within a short time, the story spread with terrifying speed, shared and discussed everywhere, and people who had never even seen Ria's face suddenly appointed themselves judges of her life. They came to the diner where she had once worked, then followed her to the restaurant where she had only recently begun her new job. Some came merely to stare out of curiosity, some held up their phones to record her, and others hurled cruel words directly at her. The restaurant owner, a man who genuinely admired her talent but lacked the courage to stand beside her in the middle of the public storm, called her into his office and told her apologetically that perhaps she should take some time away until everything quieted down, because her presence was making customers uncomfortable and affecting the business. It was a dismissal spoken in gentle language, but Ria understood its true meaning. and she simply removed her apron, folded it neatly, placed it on the table, and thanked him for giving her the opportunity, without a single word of resentment, even though something inside her chest was breaking apart. She walked out of the restaurant beneath the weight of prying eyes, holding her head high as she passed through the crowd, whispering behind her, and only when she reached her small room and closed the door did she allow herself to sink onto the edge of the bed and bury her face in her hands. Even then, she didn't cry, because she had learned long ago that tears were a luxury someone like her had no time to spend, and because Noah was playing in the next room and she didn't want him to see her fall apart. She drew a deep breath, stood, washed her face, and when Noah ran in and asked whether she had bought the ingredients to make the cake he loved, she smiled at him as though the world outside didn't exist, as though people hadn't just thrown stones at her heart. The only thing that filled her with unbearable fear wasn't the job she had lost or the insults being thrown at her, but the thought that Desmond would see the video, that he would hear what people were saying about her, and that somewhere deep inside he might begin to wonder whether any part of it was true. She wasn't afraid of being judged by the entire city, but she was afraid of losing the trust in the eyes of the man who had only just returned to her life, the one person who had ever looked at her as though she had worth. She had no idea that on the other side of the city, when the video was placed before Desmond, he didn't doubt her for even a second. Instead, a cold and deadly fury was slowly rising in his eyes. The fury of a man who had just realized that someone had dared to touch the one thing he was willing to protect with his own life. While the storm of public outrage closed in around Rhea, someone had been watching everything quietly from the shadows and realized that the moment he had waited for so long had finally arrived. Arlo Fenn was Desmond's right-hand man, a master of deception who had staged a flawless alibi 9 years ago to earn Desmond's absolute trust, placing the deepest secrets of the Empire within his reach. Precisely because he stood so close, Fenn was the first to recognize the change taking place within the Kingpin. He saw Desmond becoming increasingly distracted from his work, saw him softening because of a woman, and to a man like Fenn, that weakness wasn't something to pity, but an opportunity. For a long time, deep within himself, he had nurtured an ambition hidden carefully behind the appearance of loyalty, the ambition to seize everything that belonged to Desmond, and to achieve that, he had secretly joined forces with a rival gang, men who had long hungered to swallow the empire Desmond ruled. Fenn understood that as long as Desmond remained the same cold and razor-sharp man he had always been, no one could touch him, but a Desmond distracted by emotion could become prey that might finally be brought down. He also realized that the key to destroying that man didn't lie in guns or business deals, but in the very woman Desmond was trying to protect. Fenn approached Cora because he was cunning enough to see that she wanted Rhea removed just as desperately as he did, and two people driven by different motives sat down together inside a locked room where the light was only bright enough to reveal the calculations written across their faces. Cora told him that she wanted the woman gone from Desmond's life, that she wanted to reclaim the position and the fortune slipping from her grasp. And Fenn smiled and promised that he would take care of it, that she could leave the removal of this obstacle entirely to him. Yet as he spoke those words, Fenn was already making a very different calculation, one he never allowed Cora to see. To him, Rhea wasn't merely an obstacle to be eliminated, but a piece on the board, a lure, a fatal weakness he could use to draw Desmond into a trap and strip everything from his hands. Cora believed she was hiring Fenn as a tool for her own purposes, but in truth, she was the one being used, pulled into a deadly gamble whose full danger she didn't understand. There was something else Cora didn't know, something Fenn had buried so deeply that even Desmond, who had trusted him for years, had never once suspected it. Fenn wasn't a newly corrupted traitor whose greed had only recently awakened, but a serpent that had been hiding inside the organization for a very long time. A man carrying a dark secret tied to Desmond's own past, a secret that would shake everything if it were ever exposed. For now, however, he continued to wear the same calm and loyal expression whenever he stood before his employer, still nodding obediently, still accepting orders, while beneath that mask, the threads of an enormous trap were being drawn tighter, one by one. The air around Desmond began to feel strangely suffocating, and unusual signs appeared here and there before he had time to connect them. A few trusted men suddenly became difficult to reach. Certain streams of information were abruptly disrupted, and the instincts of someone who had survived countless conspiracies warned him that something was wrong directly beneath his feet. Yet cruelly, at the very moment when he needed his judgment and sharpness most, his heart was consumed by fear for Rhea's safety amid the storm surrounding her, and that distraction was exactly what Fenn had calculated down to the smallest detail. In the darkness of the city, the trap was nearly complete, and all Fen was waiting for was the right moment to tighten it, a moment he knew would come soon, when he finally moved against the very woman Desmond was willing to sacrifice his entire empire to protect. The moment Fen had been waiting for arrived one evening, when Rhea left her rented room to buy a few necessities, having fortunately left Noah in the care of a kind neighbor so he wouldn't have to go outside with her in the cold, and it was that absence that kept the boy beyond the reach of the danger about to descend upon her. As she walked alone along the deserted street, a car without license plates pulled close to the curb, and before she could react, several figures closed in on her from behind. Rhea fought back. She struggled and cried out for help, but the men were too strong and too fast, and the only thing she managed to do in her panic was wrap her arms instinctively around her rounded belly, trying to protect the tiny life inside her as they forced her into the vehicle and slammed the door shut. The car sped into the darkness, carrying Rhea to a shadowy warehouse in an abandoned industrial district on the outskirts of the city, a place where any cry for help would dissolve into the emptiness without ever reaching another human ear. She was held inside a bare room, and although fear was closing around her throat, although her heart was pounding wildly with terror for her unborn child, she forced herself to remain calm, breathing as slowly as she could, whispering to herself and to the baby inside her that everything would be all right, that she would find a way to get both of them out of there. It was then that Arlo Fen entered, and for the first time, Rhea saw the face of the man who had been pulling every string, a face so calm that it chilled her blood, without any outward cruelty, and somehow even more frightening because of its composure. He pulled over a chair and sat across from her, and in an almost courteous voice, he told her that she didn't need to be afraid, that she was merely a piece in a much larger game, that he held no personal hatred toward her, and that she was simply the most precious thing in the world to the man he intended to destroy. He said that Desmond Kelleher had spent his entire life making certain he never had a weakness, never loving anyone deeply enough to be wounded through them, and that she was his first mistake and his last. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Desmond received the call Fen had arranged, and when the familiar voice of the man he had trusted for so many years came through the telephone and informed him that Rhea was in his hands, Desmond's entire world seemed to collapse and freeze at the same time. Fen stated his terms with brutal clarity, that if Desmond wanted the woman returned safely, he would have to sign over complete control of his empire, surrender everything he had spent his life building, and reduce himself with his own hand from a powerful kingpin to a man who possessed nothing. He would have to come alone, without his men, without contacting the police, or Fen couldn't guarantee the safety of either Rhea or the child. After lowering the phone, Desmond stood motionless in the middle of the room, and in that moment he faced the most terrible choice of his life. The empire he controlled was everything he had. It was what he had sacrificed his soul to build, the fortress that had protected him from the merciless world that had nearly crushed him when he was a homeless boy. To give it up meant returning to the place where he had begun, vulnerable and unprotected, exposed to every enemy he had created over the years. But when he closed his eyes, what appeared in his mind wasn't the casinos, the money, or the power. It was the image of a thin young woman inside a snowbound laundromat, the girl who had pushed her last container of food toward him without asking for anything in return, the girl who had fastened a promise around his wrist and told him that he had to survive. He thought of her smile as she fed Noah warm porridge, of her calloused hands, of the way she had held her head high in the banquet hall and beneath the storm of public condemnation without allowing herself to fall. And he finally understood something he should have understood long ago, that the empire he had clung to had never truly been the thing that kept him alive. It was the kindness of that woman all those years before that had saved him, and now it was his turn to choose. He opened his eyes, and there was no hesitation left in their dark blue depths. The man the entire city believed had lost his heart long ago made his decision, that if he had to surrender his empire and his own life to bring Rhea and her child home safely, then it was a price he would pay without regret. He placed his coat over his shoulders and walked out through the door alone, heading directly into the trap he knew was waiting for him. Because this time, unlike that snowy night 9 years earlier when he had run to keep her safe, he wouldn't run away. He would go to her, to repay the debt of kindness he had carried in his heart for an entire decade. Desmond arrived at the warehouse alone, just as Fen had demanded, but a man who had survived countless conspiracies never truly walked into a trap without calculations of his own, and while Fen believed victory was already within his grasp, Desmond had quietly arranged for a few of his most loyal remaining men to follow at a safe distance. The moment he entered that dark and freezing space, his eyes found Rhea being held in a corner of the room, and merely seeing that she was unharmed, her arms still wrapped protectively around her rounded belly, lifted part of the terrible weight pressing against his chest. Fen emerged from the shadows wearing the same composed smile and mocked Desmond, saying that he couldn't believe the man of steel feared by an entire city could be foolish enough to surrender himself for a woman. Desmond didn't respond to the provocation. He asked Fen only one question: why, after all those years of standing beside him, he had chosen betrayal. And that question opened the door to the truth Fen had buried for an entire decade. He laughed loudly, a bitter and poisonous sound, then said that Desmond had never truly realized who he was, had never understood that the man standing closest beside him was the very person who had laid the foundation for every tragedy in his life. He revealed that 9 years earlier, he had been the one who betrayed Desmond's foster father to his enemies, the one who provided the information that led to the death of the man who had sheltered and raised Desmond. And afterward, he had skillfully worked his way into the organization, pretended to be loyal, and waited patiently through all those years for the day when he could swallow everything whole. As Desmond listened, he stood frozen, while the entire landscape of a past he had believed he understood shattered and rearranged itself into a completely different picture, and the anger rising inside him was no longer the familiar cold fury, but a consuming flame. Yet Fen wasn't finished, because he wanted to savor every moment of what he believed was his victory, and he delivered one final revelation, something that left even Rhea, restrained in the corner of the room, stunned. He turned toward her and cruelly asked whether she had ever wondered why her fiancé had disappeared so mysteriously. Rhea's head snapped up, and Fen continued, saying that the accountant had accidentally discovered the dirty numbers hidden in the organization's financial records, had learned things he should never have known, and had therefore become a threat that needed to be eliminated. He said that when the man realized he was being hunted, he understood that as long as he remained beside Rhea, she would be in danger too, and that was why he chose to leave her, sever every connection, and disappear from her life. Not because he was a coward or because he had rejected her as she had believed for so many years, but as one final, desperate attempt to keep her safe before Fen could reach him. Tears spilled from Rhea's eyes as she listened, and months of resentment collapsed inside her in a single moment, because the man she had hated for so long, the one she believed had abandoned her when she needed him most, had actually left to protect her, and had paid for that choice with his life. In that grief-stricken moment, she looked up at Desmond, and together they recognized a heartbreaking similarity, that both men who had entered her life, her former fiancé and the Desmond standing before her now, had chosen to distance themselves from her to keep her safe, with the only difference being that one had never been given the chance to return, while the other was standing there now, ready to sacrifice everything in order to come back to her. Fen believed his revelations would destroy his opponent's spirit, but he was wrong, because instead of breaking Desmond, the pain gave him a new strength, and Desmond told Fen in a voice so calm it was terrifying that he had made a fatal mistake by believing the fear of loss would make him weak, when in truth it had turned him into the most dangerous man he had ever been. At that moment, Desmond's loyal men surged into the warehouse from every direction, and a violent struggle erupted in the darkness, with pounding footsteps, shouted commands, and the sound of objects crashing to the floor filling the space with chaos. Desmond charged directly at Fen, and in the fierce confrontation that followed, he unleashed all the fury that had accumulated inside him for an entire decade, until at last the traitor was overpowered and forced to his knees on the freezing warehouse floor, the scheming man who had believed he controlled every piece, now defeated beneath the feet of the man he had betrayed. Desmond didn't kill him, even though in that moment he had every reason to do so, because he knew there were punishments heavier than death, and he wanted Fen to remain alive and face everything he had done. He stepped past the fallen traitor and went straight to Rhea, knelt before her, and with trembling hands removed the ropes that bound her. Then he gathered her and the child inside her into his arms, whispering near her ear that he had come, that she was safe now, and that this time he would never allow anyone to hurt her again. After the night at the warehouse, everything began coming to light with such speed that even those responsible for the crimes had no time to protect themselves, because when Arlo Fen was cornered and understood that he would have to pay for what he had done, he did exactly what the nature of a traitor always drove him to do. He dragged everyone who had ever joined hands with him down into the abyss. It turned out that throughout the time he had been plotting, Fen had carefully recorded his conversations with Cora, keeping them as a form of protection in case he ever needed them. And now that he had fallen, he didn't hesitate to release everything as one final act of revenge. In those recordings, Cora Vance's voice could be heard clearly and unmistakably, describing in detail how she had hired people to fabricate the edited video used to smear Ria's name, how she had conspired with Fen to drive the woman out of Desmond's life, and how she had been willing to destroy an innocent person simply to protect her wealth and position. When those recordings reached the authorities and spread to the public, the entire castle of lies Cora had spent so long building collapsed in an instant. The people who had once surrounded her in hopes of winning her favor turned their backs just as quickly as they had once flattered her. The doors that had once opened wide to welcome her now slammed shut, and the Vance name, once the pride of an entire family, suddenly became a stain everyone wanted to avoid. There was a moment when Cora stood alone in her lavish room, which had now become hollow and empty, and saw on the screen the image of the woman she had tried to destroy. She watched Ria standing there, exhausted but still holding her head high, one hand resting against the curve of her belly. And in that quiet moment, something stirred faintly inside Cora, a late and painful awareness of what she had done, of how she had nearly crushed an innocent life because of her greed and fear. She said nothing and offered no defense. She simply stood there alone with the naked truth of who she had become. And perhaps that was the heaviest punishment a woman like her could ever be forced to bear. Yet the most remarkable thing, the thing that transformed the entire story, didn't come from the recordings or from Desmond's power, but from the ordinary people of the poor neighborhood on the south side of the city. The people Ria had lived among and helped for years without ever expecting anything in return. When the storm of public outrage that had once buried her began to fade, and the truth slowly emerged, her neighbors, the regular customers from the diner, and the people she had quietly supported during their hardest moments stepped forward and spoke for her of their own accord. The woman who ran the shop on the corner told how many times Ria had slipped pastries into her child's hands, claiming they were leftovers that hadn't sold, when in truth she had deliberately made extra so she could give them away. An elderly man who lived alone said that on freezing winter nights, she had always brought him a bowl of hot soup even though she herself had almost nothing to spare. The mother of a large family told how, when she had reached the darkest and most desperate point of her life, Ria had been the one who quietly helped her without ever speaking of it or seeking praise. One by one, they told small stories of her kindness, and those honest stories, spoken with all the gratitude of ordinary people, carried more power than any campaign money could have purchased. The public that had once turned against her now reversed itself, and the woman who had been smeared as a calculating schemer was finally seen for who she truly was, someone who had given so much despite possessing so little. What mattered most was that Desmond, although he had enough power and wealth to arrange any campaign he wished to clear her name, didn't do so, because he understood that it would once again take away her own voice. He only stood beside her publicly, allowing the entire city to know that he trusted and cherished this woman, but he let the truth speak through the people who had truly known her, allowing the kindness she had planted through so many years to blossom and bear fruit in its own way. And when Ria learned that it was her own poor neighbors who had stepped forward to defend her, she couldn't hold back her tears, not because her name had been cleared, but because she realized that the seeds of kindness she had quietly planted during the days that had once seemed most hopeless had never been forgotten. They had been growing silently in the hearts of the people around her, and at the very moment when she needed them most, they had returned to shelter her. In the rare, peaceful days after the storm had passed, as Ria and Desmond sat together in the small room now filled with a warmth and light it had never known before, the final truths were revealed, truths that brought the long circle of their story to a close. One evening, when Ria spoke again of the most difficult period of her life, the time when her mother, the only family she had ever known before the woman passed away, became gravely ill and needed an enormous amount of money for medical care that a young woman without a home could never hope to gather, she told him that at the most desperate moment, when every last hope had been exhausted, an inexplicable miracle had occurred. The entire hospital bill had suddenly been paid by a stranger, an anonymous benefactor whose identity she had never been able to discover, so that she might offer even a single word of gratitude. She told the story with a thankfulness that remained undiminished after all those years, never noticing that the man beside her had suddenly fallen silent, his eyes fixed upon some distant place. Then Desmond spoke softly, his voice low and hesitant, and confessed that he had been that stranger. He explained that after the snowy night in the laundromat, Although he had forced himself to disappear from her life in order to keep her safe, there hadn't been a single day when he had truly forgotten her, and during those first years, when he had still been quietly watching over her from afar, he had learned of her mother's condition. He said that he had secretly paid the hospital expenses, only that one time, as an awkward attempt to repay a small part of the debt of kindness he carried in his heart. But he had deliberately concealed his identity, not because he wanted to keep it a secret, but because deep inside he believed he didn't deserve to appear before her. The man he had become, and the dark world into which he had entered, had convinced him that her life would be better if she never had to see him again. Tears slipped silently down Ria's face as she listened, because she realized that throughout all those years when she had believed herself completely alone in the world, someone had always been watching over her from the darkness, the very person she had once saved, and that the kindness she had given away on that winter night had never disappeared, but had quietly returned to shelter her at the moment when she needed it most. Yet there was still one final truth, something even Desmond had only recently discovered as the hidden secrets were brought into the light, and it was the revelation that stunned them both more than any other. When the records concerning Ria's late fiancé were uncovered, an unexpected connection emerged. Noah, the boy Ria had sheltered and loved as her own child for so many years, the child for whom she had sold everything she possessed in order to save his life when he became ill, was in fact the younger brother of the man she had once planned to marry. When their parents had passed away years ago, her fiancé had brought the young boy into their lives, and together they had raised him. When her fiancé was forced to vanish to protect them from Fenn's men, he had left Noah in Ria's loving hands, knowing she was the only person in the world who would protect his little brother with her very life. Ria sat in silence for a long time after understanding the truth, overwhelmed by an emotion she couldn't put into words, because all those years when she believed she was merely sheltering an unrelated orphan, she had unknowingly been protecting the last remaining blood of the family of the man who had passed through her life. The man she had once resented but now understood had gone away because he wanted her to remain safe. She looked toward the adjoining room, where Noah was absorbed in coloring a picture, and when his bright eyes lifted toward her, he gave her an innocent smile. In that moment, Ria understood that the love she had given him through all those years had never been a meaningless accident, but a thread of destiny binding the scattered and broken pieces of her life into one complete circle. She walked over to him and held him tightly in her arms, and Noah, although he didn't yet understand everything that was happening, could feel the love within that embrace and rested his head against her with complete trust. Desmond stood watching them, the woman carrying within her a new life belonging to the future, and the boy carrying within him a bond to the past. And he understood that family wasn't defined by blood or by calculation, but was woven from the choices people made to love one another, and that this woman, through the vastness of her heart, had created a family from lives the world seemed to have abandoned, including his own. After everything he had endured, Desmond Kelleher did something that no one who knew him in the underworld could ever have imagined. He decided to let go of the entire empire he had spent his life building. He understood that the power he had once believed was the only thing keeping him alive was in truth nothing more than a cold wall imprisoning him, and that the man he wanted to become, the man Ria deserved, could never exist within that darkness. One by one, he dismantled what he had created, handed things over, closed them down, and severed every thread that had once bound him to his former world. And although the road toward redemption wouldn't be easy and would stretch far into the future, for the first time in many years he felt free, able to breathe, able to live as a real human being rather than as a shadow feared by an entire city. And when he was finally ready to begin again, he didn't take Ria to a magnificent restaurant or some extravagant place to tell her the most important thing he had ever said in his life. Instead, he brought her back to where everything had begun, the little laundromat on the corner of a poor street, where the machines still turned with their steady rhythm and the familiar scent of soap remained in the air, where 9 winters earlier, a young woman had saved a starving boy with half a meal and a heart that asked for nothing in return. Beneath the gentle light of that old laundromat, Desmond lowered himself to one knee before Ria, and he didn't speak to her with ornate words, but with the bare sincerity of a man who had learned how to love from the beginning. He told her that he wasn't asking her to accept a powerful kingpin, because that man no longer existed. He was asking her to give him the chance to become a man who knew how to stay, a man who knew how to bow his head and apologize when he was wrong, a man who would never again use money or power as a substitute for genuine love. He told her that throughout his life, he had believed the only way to protect something was to control it, but she had taught him that loving someone meant allowing them to be free, walking beside them rather than walking in their place. Then he took her hand, the calloused hand he treasured more than every jewel in the world, gently placing her fingers over the old leather bracelet still resting on his own wrist, and asked her to marry him. Rhea looked down at the man kneeling before her, the man she had saved when he had been nothing, the man who had disappeared and then returned, the man who had surrendered an entire empire to bring her home safely, and tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of happiness. She told him that she would marry him, but she wanted him to understand that she wasn't saying yes to the powerful man an entire city had once feared, nor to the man who could have bought the whole world. She was saying yes to the man who had learned how to stay, who had learned tenderness, who had found again the good-hearted boy who had once been buried deep inside him. And in that moment, inside the laundromat where their story had begun 9 years earlier, two people who had been broken by life in different ways found each other once again, not as a young woman saving a boy, but as two adults choosing to build a home together from the shattered pieces of the past, a home neither of them had ever known but both had always longed for. The story of Rhea and Desmond leaves us with something simple yet profound, that the kindness we give, no matter how small and no matter how little we expect in return, is never truly lost. It quietly takes root somewhere, only to return and save us at the moment we need it most. It reminds us that no human being is forever defined by what they have become, because even a heart that seems to have turned to stone can be awakened by the memory of someone who once treated it with genuine compassion, and that a person's true worth isn't measured by the power or wealth they possess, but by the kindness they choose to preserve, even when life has given them no reason to remain kind. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so that each day you can join us in listening to more meaningful and heartwarming stories. How do you feel about the story of Rhea and Desmond, and what part of their journey moved you most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings that came from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your most sincere reflections. May everyone listening to this story always be blessed with good health, a joyful life, peace, and abundant love each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the stories to come.